Hi everyone, my name is Hogan. For those of you who I haven't met yet, I'm a PhD student at Columbia in the Sustainable Development Department. I'm going to show you some early to mid-stage work with some co-authors, Cameron Pelton, who's at UCSB Brennan School, and John Proctor, who's finishing his postdoc at Harvard. The name of the project is the Global Water Resource Costs of Agricultural Adaptation to Climate Change. Issues of water security and water stress are becoming increasingly popular as topics in the popular media. I'm showing you on the right here a recent article from the New York Times that documents the spatial distribution of water stress. But approximately 90% of water consumptive use around the globe is through agriculture. And therefore, declining freshwater resources are a threat to both the stability of food as well as the stability of agricultural markets. There isn't so much work about how this interacts with future climate change. And in particular, there's two mechanisms through which we think climate change might affect freshwater scarcity. Firstly, there's the direct channel, which is through the hydroclimatic interactions between temperature, precipitation, and water availability, both in aquifers, reservoirs, and rivers. And secondly, there's the indirect channel, which is through how people use water. So are we going to irrigate crops more? Are we going to consume more water? And so that's the second channel through which we might care about climate change in this context. And so the idea of this project, generally speaking, is to provide global empirical estimates of how changes in weather and climate influence local water availability, accounting for endogenous agricultural adaptation. So if we think that on really hot days, farmers might irrigate their crops more to offset the impacts of climate change, we want to account for that when we think about this overall impact of climate on water availability. And we've seen a lot of math in the last couple of days, so instead I'm going to show you a picture to think about these mechanisms. So here we have a representative crop. This crop is fed by both rainfall and irrigation. This water permeates the soil, portion of which recharges groundwater beneath the Earth's surface, and another portion of which is released back into the atmosphere through evapotranspiration. So let's consider the impact of a particularly hot day. On a hot day, evapotranspiration increases as more water is released from the soil through evaporation, and plants release more water through transpiration, and soil moisture decreases. Our representative farmer, they might think, okay, I might need to continue watering my crops, but it's a really hot day and I don't have access to water except for water that's beneath the Earth's surface. And so I'm going to increase irrigation intensity, which is going to increase soil moisture, but draw water from the ground, thereby feeding back into the into the atmospheric system through increased evapotranspiration. And so the key thing about this project is that we want to disentangle sort of this overall effect of the natural climate system on water resources that are available from this sort of other thing that people are doing to irrigate their crops and through human behavior modifying the way that temperature affects water availability. And so this motivates three concrete, more formal research questions. The first is, how does temperature influence changes in water resources over land? And so we want this overall effect of the climate system on water availability. And the second is, what is the role of agricultural adaptation of human practices on the temperature effects of water resources? And then thirdly, what does this mean for future climate change? Under different scenarios of warming, under different scenarios of agricultural land use, how do we think about what the future might look like in terms of the spatial distribution of available water? And so just to situate this a little bit in the context of the literature, of course, this is related to a large literature in economics about climate impacts on agriculture, as well as adaptation to those severe impacts. In terms of yields, this is a pretty well-documented relationship that starts with seminal work in 2009 by Wolfram Schlenker and Michael Roberts. And since then, people have thought about different ways of measuring the way that people adapt to the agricultural impacts of climate change, with not so much of great evidence about agricultural adaptation, at least in the US context, but recent work that looks at a more global scale has found significant benefits as well as costs associated with agricultural adaptation. And then there's a second strand of literature within economics that looks at specific agricultural practices and the extent to which those agricultural practices defend farmers and society from the impacts of climate change on agricultural outputs. Certain practices such as crop migration, irrigation, and other forms of land use, In particular, this Charles Taylor paper, which is a working paper from last year, looks at the impact of historical warming on the expansion of irrigation and the downstream impact of that expansion on groundwater use. And then there's a separate field of research, mostly in the natural sciences, that sort of tries to document trends in water storage and also trends in irrigation's impact on water availability. The former tends to take a global perspective and uses satellite data to think about how water availability interacts with hydroclimatic extremes. And the latter looks more at small scale in situ or on the ground measurements of water availability and irrigation to think about how that lever works. However, there hasn't been a global analysis of the response of water availability to temperature that accounts for this endogenous use of agricultural practice. And so our contributions in, I guess, more concrete terms are the following. First, we estimate this global response of water availability to year-to-year fluctuations in weather. So relative to this natural science literature, we're bringing in panel fixed effects methods to think about what the maybe a more plausibly causal relationship between these two things are. And secondly, we're going to use heterogeneity in the weather response based on what we know about cropped area and what we know about irrigation intensity to think about what the agricultural adaptation costs of this additional use of groundwater would be. And then third, we're going to project these impacts into the future using our response functions. And we're going to think about what the distribution of water is under different climate and agricultural land use scenarios. Today, I'm going to show you something on 1 and 2, but 3 is not yet today. Great. So taking a step back, I want to talk a little bit about how we're measuring water availability. To do so, we're going to use this measurement called total water storage. And to define total water storage, it's the sum of all water above and below the Earth's surface. So this includes groundwater, soil moisture, surface water, and snow and ice. It's determined by the water cycle in the way that I showed you in the graphic before, in the sense that it's supplied by rainfall and consumed through evaporation and runoff. And therefore, it represents sort of a total aggregate measure of land water availability in a given location. We're going to use a recent satellite that's provides data from the last 20 years called the Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment, also known as GRACE, which provides satellite-derived measures of changes in local total water storage. And so here's a map of the GRACE output. These are trends over the entire sample period. And you can see there's pretty high spatial variation in where places are systematically losing water, places where water is being systematically gained. We also rely on weather data and also data on the agricultural land use. So the top two maps here showing average monthly precipitation and average monthly temperature, we rely on daily distributions. But that data comes from aerified plans. And then on the bottom, I'm showing you on the bottom left here is cropped area fraction, which we get from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And on the right here is area equipped for irrigation, which is FAO data from their global map of irrigated areas. And to talk very quickly about the empirical strategy, I promised you no equations, but I guess here on the left-hand side, we have total water storage as measured by GRACE. And so we're aggregating all of the data that I showed you before to a GRACE grid cell. We're running a grid cell level regression over the 20 years for which we have data. And so total water storage is measured in grid cell I in month M and year T. And then we have a flexible function of temperature, 6-degree bin, daily average temperature, and a flexible function of freezing, which in this case is a 4-quarter polynomial. And then we have a pretty rich set of fixed effects here for each grid cell for water basin by month and water basin by year. And I can play around with those. I've tried trends. I've tried more specific, finer controls on the time fixed effects, and the results that I'm going to show you are fairly robust to all of those options. Great. So this is on the left here, the response of total water storage to changes in temperature. You can see a fairly linear relationship on average across our entire sample. In particular, at a very hot 40-degree, between 35 and 40-degree day, we see about a 0.1 centimeter drop in water heights. So that means 1 centimeter of water spread over an entire grid cell lowers by 0.1 centimeters on a particularly hot day. For people who are ag-minded, that's about 10,000 acre-feet of water. And for people who aren't ag-minded, that's about 25,000 metric tons of almonds you convert it into crop. On the right here, we recover a pretty reasonable relationship between rainfall and total water storage, showing that about 10 centimeters of rainfall corresponds to about 2 centimeters of water height on average. Great. And then the second thing we want to do is look at heterogeneity in this overall response based on what we know about where crops are planted and how much irrigation is used, to think about what the difference might be for places that are more likely to irrigate their crops and to potentially attribute that to agricultural adaptation. And so this response here, everything in the X beta at the end here is the precip and all of the fixed effect controls. But on the left, we have our flexible function of temperature multiplied by crop area fraction in a Grace grid cell, plus that function of temperature times the amount of irrigation, the area equipped for irrigation in that grid cell, plus a double interaction between those two and our function of temperature. And so for an entirely uncropped grid cell, the response looks, and I've changed the y-axis here to trick you a little bit, but the response looks fairly similar, slightly lower, almost by a magnitude of 1/2 relative to what I showed you before. And now for a grid cell that's entirely cropped but not irrigated, we can see that this the nonlinearities in this relationship start to kick in, and the effective temperature on total water storage increases by about 3. And then for a grid cell that's entirely cropped and entirely irrigated, we can see a dramatic effect of a really hot day on total water storage of about -1, between -0.8 and -0.1, which is a quite large effect. And so, as I said, this is sort of early stage work, but so far what we've shown to you is that we can uncover a linear relationship between temperature and total water storage, as well as important key heterogeneity in that relationship based on where crops are grown and the amount of area equipped for irrigation. Our next steps are threefold. First, we want to continue thinking carefully about potential endogeneity concerns. I think in this particular context, SIPM violations are quite important, as well as recent research by Thomas Braun and Wolfram Schleicher shows that there might be a problem with reverse causality in this context, in the sense that irrigation might actually affect temperature through evapotranspiration. And so we want to think carefully about those things. We've started to incorporate like high resolution streamflow data that's globally representative. And I think our next step is to use that sort of as a lever to think more about these types of endogeneity concerns. The second thing is endogeneity on our interactions. And so we're characterizing heterogeneity in this relationship based on this cross-sectional idea of crop area fraction in the area equipped for irrigation. And so we want to think about maybe a more sophisticated matching estimator or other ways that we might characterize that heterogeneity in a more plausibly possible way. And then the third thing, as I mentioned before, is thinking about the future of climate change, and in particular under different scenarios of warming from CMIP6, and also different assumptions about how agricultural land use might develop in the future. We want to think about the spatial distribution of water scarcity and water stress, and whether places that are currently growing crops most right now are places that we would expect to see to be the most water stressed in the future. That's all I have. Thanks very much.